so it's a hard C because it's a Welsh word. It means Cynefin.
Oh, nice.
Cynefin. Welsh, yeah, there's about.
So you know how your heart is like split into different places, and you come up over here, right, Dan? You come up to this place, and you're like, I was a kid here, right? And where do you live now?
Hamilton, blueberry capital of the world.
Right, and you belong there as well. You feel like yeah. Anywhere else in the world you feel like you have a sense of belonging, connected to?
Boston.
Boston, okay. So for whatever reason, you know, we just live in all these different places, and it's, you know, we come from places, we live in places. You know, one of the greatest definitions I know of belonging is that the place knows who you are. Right? You show up in a place and people know who you are, and you belong to that place. Right? So it's not a personal thing. Now, my elders, my mom's family's Ojibwe, and so I spent a lot of time trying to learn a bit about that culture because I wasn't raised in it. And I was asking my elders, like, what's the word we have in Ojibwe for belonging? And one of my elders said, the word is Indene Umanganik. Indene Umanganik. Try it. Indene Umanganik. And that's a common word you hear at the end of a prayer, which means all my relations often. And so you often hear people end a prayer with all my relations. And so when I asked my elder and I said about this thing, she said, yeah, I think the word for belonging we would use is Inedemaganik. And I said, Inedemaganik, I've heard that at the end of prayers. I thought it meant all my relations. And she scolds me, right? I get scolded by elders all the time. Right? And you just do what you've always done. So if you're like if you're an accountant, then everything is like solvable on the spreadsheet. If you're a poet, then everything's a poem. Right? And so if you don't think about what you're doing, like everything can become a poem, and then you become intolerable to work with. So the space of disorder is a dangerous space to work with. That's kind of our default setting. We need to be thinking carefully about like what are the kinds of problems we're looking at, and what is the context of our work. An obvious problem is a problem in which the cause and the effect are just clear. It's just obvious. I mean, it's called obvious for a reason. An example of an obvious problem: organize yourself by height. Anybody can do it. You can automate it. Most obvious problems can be automated. The solutions can be automated. Opening a door is an obvious problem. You know, once you learn how to use the door, push and pull, it's the same forever for the rest of your life. Some doors slide, some doors do other things, but you can automate door opening. That's how you know it's an obvious problem. Okay? And in an obvious problem, Best practices are awesome. You figure out how to open a door and you're set for life, right? You figure out how to arrange people by height like that, you never have to use another method of arranging people by height ever for the rest of your life. Okay? Best practice applies. There's 3 other domains, and best practices have no application in any of them. So that's the first thing to say goodbye to. Goodbye, easy world with all the solutions.
Wait. Our funders ask us for best practices all the time.
It's so interesting, isn't it?
It is.
Our funders ask us, and we ask of ourselves about best practices all the time. I'll explain why our funders have it wrong.
Just 3 days.
Oh, this doesn't take long. This doesn't take long at all. Okay, here's a complicated problem. Complicated problem has some causes and effects. You know, they're like, maybe there's different causes, different effects. But basically with a complicated problem, you can figure it out. You can figure it out. You need an expert, you might need an expert to come in and figure it out, but it's figure-outable. All right? So an obvious problem might be turning a tap on and off. Again, it can be automated. A friend of mine young friend of mine was in the ferry terminal, and we were washing our hands in the washroom together, and he's like waving his hands at the tap, and nothing's happening. And he's like, "What's going on?" And I'm like, "Here's the faucet." Here's the faucet on, and he looks up at me and he goes, "Oh, analog." That's like so cool. So cool. Okay. So obvious to turn it on and off the tap, right? But when you turn the tap off and the water keeps coming, how many of you is that an obvious problem to? Yeah, well, the obvious problem is the yellow pages, because there's a plumber in there for whom this is an easy thing to fix. But me, I'm panicking, I'm like, right? So complicated problems are knowable by somebody. They're fundamentally knowable. You just need the right person who's trained for years in how plumbing works, or electricity, or how to build a building, how to make a Volvo, how to do different things. So technology, these are technical solutions. So if you're familiar with the whole world of technical versus adaptive leadership, right? All the stuff on this side of the paper is technical. And if you're a technician, thank you for living, because we've got technical problems to solve. In your daily life, you've got technical problems to solve, right? So like, what are some of the things you do on a daily basis that are just technical and knowable? What are the obvious things you do every day in your work? You look at your mail, right? Paperwork, like filling out the form, right? Once you learn how to do it, okay, got it, figured it out. Driving, yeah, there are elements of driving that are technical, for sure. What to do when you have a New Jersey driver honking on your ass because you have New York plates introduces a whole level of emergence. We have strategies! How many of you have like specific technical expertise you work with in your organization? Like budget, law, legal stuff. Anybody? Are you all generalists? Nobody has any professionals in the room?
Reports.
Yeah, absolutely a level of doing reports. And in fact, some of the work imagine that happens in your world is you're the people with the technical solutions around how to get reports, how to get supports, right? Your technical ability helps connect people to what they need in what is otherwise an incredibly confusing world. So because you live in it and you know where everybody is and how to do all these things, that makes it easy. And so it seems complicated. You know it's complicated. You know there's someone who can help you solve it. And to that person, it's going to be obvious. Well, you just got to fill out an 8234 and then do a triplicate and send it to this person. I mean, piece of cake, right? And trust me, the person you just said that to is wiping their brow and like figuring out how big a check they can write to you for that piece of obvious answer. So that's good. So I want to just say, like, there's lots in the world that's good about this kind of stuff and this kind of planning. And in a complicated problem, because what happens is the further you go around this thing, the more context comes into play, right? The more different your context is going to be. So a tap is a tap is a tap is a tap, pretty much, except in a boutique hotel somewhere. an accounting form is an accounting form is an accounting form is an accounting form. It might need a bit of context, but basically at the end of the day, you can come up with some good practices and they'll be reliable. And if you need to improve a practice, you do that with good research, right? And just figure stuff out. Okay, cool? I mean, this is obvious because I just want to leave this behind now. Because as I say, a lot of our world, we want our world to work like this. At the very least, we want our world to be complicated, right? In other words, solvable. So even using the language of like, oh, we came to a solution. So I really in a complex system, that language doesn't even make sense. Like, what is the solution to a flower? Right? What is the solution to a community? It's like, is a community a problem? Yeah, it's also a product and a solution. So all of that linearity, that we start with a problem, we A, B, C, D, and then we come up with a solution, that applies beautifully here. It doesn't apply when we're working in complex systems. Because the way complex systems work is that there are lots of causes, everything from poverty to racism to the weather to Jack and Ozzy. And the effect of all of these causes coming together is an emergent effect. So in other words, the effect of a complex system is fundamentally unknowable. You can't know what it's going to be, and it's not predictable. You can't predict what it's going to be. You can guess at possibilities, but you can't predict how it's going to turn out. And if you need any proof at all, your election campaign. I mean, who knew? Who knew? I mean, honestly, that is weird. This is not like an election campaign anybody's ever seen before. This is a completely emergent thing. Now, we can go back and understand why this election campaign is happening the way it is. And you can read miles and miles of ink that have been spilled about the causes of where we're at right now.
But they often point to one C, right? Like all of the think pieces act as if there's one C for why this is happening. It's so interesting.
Could be. But if you read really widely, you'll find all the other C's.
Right, but it's so interesting that
Yeah.
we're still searching for
For
that
that
one
one cause.
answer.
Yeah.
Exactly what happened.
Right. Because if we just know what the one answer is, we could disrupt that cause and create world peace instantly, right?
That's right, and the answer they come up with is a relatively simple one.
Right,
Right.
exactly.
It
They
tries
left these disaffected Republican voters behind and they got angry. I mean,
Yep.
that's the answer they come up with.
Yeah.
Without all the racism and the hate and the
All of it.
economic inequality.
Right.
and all.
So I just want to say, like the interesting thing about this is we could argue about that all day, right? That's partly true. That is not the whole solution. That is not the whole reason why we're in this kind of tenor of election cycle. That's why I say complex systems produce so much data that you can spend the rest of your life trying to interpret it, right? And you could even create 15 different cable news channels and have 20 different panelists all arguing about the causes for the end of time. Meanwhile, fascism happens or something. So the point I'm making is that it's like our craving for certainty and our craving for a bounded problem set, right?
Oh. She wants to say something, but I'll let her type it.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
You can talk. She's
Okay,
gonna
cool.
type that.
The craving for a bounded problem set in our society is so strong that we will reduce our field of view of causes and solutions to just something we can manage, and we will fund it. That's why our funders are wrong. Right?
Can you repeat that, please?
Yeah, because there's so many possibilities, right? And we want to make a difference. We want to impact this massive complex world that creates unimaginable amounts of poverty, inequality, whatever the problem is we're trying to fix. We reduce it down to okay, here are the key leverage points. And we even use all these mechanistic terms. Here are the key leverage points. Here's how we can move the system. Here's how we can get an efficiency. We talk about these living systems problems as if they're machines. And if we just find the right points and apply resources, by which I mean time, people, and money. Money. Time and people anyway, but money if you've got it. We apply it to a very common set. So often you'll find foundations or funders have a theory of change, right? That's based on a couple of causes. and they want to impact those causes. Even something like the social determinants of health, which is a really great framework, gets used in this predictive way. As if we just move the needle, another mechanistic term, let's move the needle on the social determinants, that'll move the needle on everything else in our community. There is a causality in complex problems. It's not predictable. That's both the heartbreak of our time, and it's the opportunity of our time. Because the way complex systems evolve is with small, tiny little actions that use emergence to go to scale. So you can start to shift a complex system from anywhere, right? And you can support things that seem to be working, and you can watch as it unfolds. But it does what you were saying earlier, Doug, it's like you follow it. You follow the energy of the system, and you try and make your good bets.
Based upon what you said earlier, without the boundaries of these walls, that experiment could have went on forever. So then that would say that there is no solution, if you will, to a complex problem. So then what are you left with?
Right. So you're left with what we do in leadership is we bring some boundedness to it. And that boundedness, I would say, I'm trying to be philosophical, but not be too obtuse here. I think part of that boundedness begins with ethics. So it's about making a choice about the kind of world you want to live in. And let me use a word that came up here, love. So in this kind of system, you can make choices based on, is this bringing more love? Because do we want more love in the world? All right, so we have an alignment here. So if we look for things where we start gathering stories of more love in the work we're doing, the results are like more loving than not, then we should just keep doing that, right? And that helps us to pay attention right here between two human beings, what's going on. It helps us to create emergent phenomena anchored around pieces of love that happen in the community. So if you get a strong chunk of love happening in a community, it can really influence things. Because the property of emergence in complex systems means that things go towards what's called attractors. The way you change things is you create a strong attractor in a system, and things will emerge, will converge around it. And I think Neighbors Inc. is like one of those things. It's like, what was there before that? What was before Neighbors Inc. in this field? It's kind of like scattered, much really. And suddenly, a little bit of vision, a little bit of action, a little bit of stuff goes on, and boom, Neighbors Inc. Now, there are a million other efforts to do what you guys are doing that failed. They just didn't work. They didn't take off for whatever reason. We don't know why. And we could do an analysis of why, but this one worked. This one worked. It's working at the moment. Right?Maybe in 100 years they may go, wow, that Neighbors Inc. thing, that was just a blip on the radar. Or it all changed in New Jersey first. Every moment the system is a choice between those things. So what do you do to stop going crazy? You just stick to your ethics. Stick to the direction of the world you want to go to. Do things that create more stories like that. Right? Stop doing things that create stories of hate and separation. Check in with each other and repeat as necessary. And there's no finish line. So there's no finish line. And it's fine.
She was saying, you said something earlier, she was saying some people don't have open mind to accept and know what you were saying about complex.
Yeah, and those are exactly the kind of people that get surprised by financial collapse and stuff like that, right? It's just like, the context doesn't care if your mind is open or not. It doesn't care, because it's going to have its way with you. So if you are not open-minded and not open to what others can bring into this kind of a system, you'll get blindsided. And it doesn't care. It'll just leave you behind. So a lot of the ways in which we create, you see this when it's very obvious in places of power. I'll tell you a story from South Africa. So I was working in South Africa, And I'm working in townships around Johannesburg. So traditionally very, very poor places. With a whole lot of community going on in there. And like many, many years of being excluded. These are all black townships, right? So many years of being excluded from the mainstream, and so there's lots of community that happens in these townships all around. And we were working with folks who organize around child welfare stuff in the townships, and really cool. And then we also had in our art of hosting a group of people who were professors from the University of South Africa, and they were all white and mostly Afrikaners. And in South Africa, the Afrikaners had the power during apartheid, and they were the ones that enforced the minority view on everybody else, okay? So what happened was, things changed in 1989 to 94 sort of thing. Things changed, apartheid disappeared, and everybody who had power before that was propped up by this racist form of governance lost their power right away. So all the government jobs got filled with all of the eminently qualified black people who were out there waiting to assume their position. Some white people kept their jobs, but there was a massive transition. And a lot of people who were in power, and a lot of these people were white men, didn't have an open mind about the change. Afrikaner men who had been born into this kind of expectation, I will always be, okay, the system always works for me. It was, a purely visible white supremacist system. And it worked for these guys. They would lose their jobs and they couldn't find a job somewhere else. And so but they were so proud that they just kept driving to work anyway until all the money ran out. And the Afrikaner professors who we were with were actually asking the community organizers from the townships about how to deal with this phenomenon that we now have 3 white shanty towns around the edges of Pretoria, which was the capital of South Africa for a long time, and the bastion of Afrikaner culture. And because of pride and a closed mind, there are now shanty towns entirely filled of white Afrikaner families. And it's just and so the learning that went on in that was just astounding, because of course these guys have been organizing townships forever, and this is how you deal with extreme poverty. It wasn't anything off of their backs. But once you could get past the shame of what had happened, you could then go and deal with the work. That's what happens if you don't have an open mind to it, right? Closed mind, it'll just leave you behind. Cool? So in complexity, dialogue is the way we've always made sense of where we're at. Dialogue is the way we figure out what our need is, what's happening in our community, what we could do next. And dialogue is also the way that we evaluate what's happening. Is this more love or less love? It's a simple metric. In a complicated system, you have very complicated metrics and targets that you have to meet. Right? If I'm building a bridge, you want me to evaluate that bridge on material strength, on weight-bearing load, on whether or not it spans the damn river, because, it can't have any gaps in it. It's not a bridge. If it has a gap, it's a ferry. That's what islanders would say. We have a bridge, it's just 300 feet long, and we have to keep moving. But you need metrics, and you need to hit those targets every single time, right? Or the bridge falls down. And so you monitor those targets, and you make sure everything you do is in service of those targets. Those numbers give you the truth. In complexity, it's the opposite. Numbers don't help you, stories contain the truth. And the more stories you tell, the more patterns you get to see, right? So instead of one grand story, this is where we can tyrannize a complex system a little bit. Tyrannical leaders get elected because they pimp one story. That's it. And everybody goes, I'm with that! And they collapse the diversity and the complexity of the world into one story. And they will lead you, that's the tyranny, right? A good strategic approach to working with story is collect as many as you can, listen to them, and then ask yourself, what's happened? What's common? What are the patterns? Oh, look, it's like when we treat people like this, and like all these stories about like how we treat people, and then we were hearing a bunch of stories yesterday about a bunch of the people you work for. And what came clear to me, and because I don't know much about how Neighbors Inc. makes its difference in the world, but there's a really interesting thing that happens. Because this is a strange state. I told you, I'm kind of like looking at the state. So I think this is a state that should have been a city, but got pulled apart by New York and Philadelphia. And so there's no city here really. I mean, there's a few little Trenton and Princeton and whatever. But mostly it's just like a shattered set of suburbs. With no herb. It's suburbs with no herb. It's a poem in there. Everything's a poem. So it's very difficult to do the kind of work you're doing where you need community and belonging to do it, right? Which is fascinating. Because there's no center. I mean, even Larry, God, Larry with his fire. Yeah, right? I mean, this is like, God, my own street, and for months, and we just got by as Larry's hauling stuff out of the, like looking at all his neighbors going, who are these insane people that I've moved in with, right? I mean, it's just, But what Neighbors Inc. does, and with the stories we were hearing yesterday, is like community gets created around some of the people you work for, and suddenly it's like, it's not just about the people that support them or work for them, it's like they make a difference in the community. Suddenly they become strange attractors in a community. Strange attractor is actually a technical term. It's like a surprising thing that happens around which everybody like turns their attention. And a strange attractor can really pull a system together. So the kind of work you do that's really, the radical nature of it is that you're fundamentally transforming how people are cared for and are a part of community, right? And what that does in the community is it turns heads. That's it. But when it turns heads, it can also turn bodies, and people can fall in. So, hearing stories of, I can't remember the guy's name, two of the stories I heard, guys that are working for the volunteer fire department, one of them going around documenting all of the streets that the city hasn't plowed. He's just like a part of the community now, and the community responds to him. And his unofficial name is the mayor of, right? Dude could get elected, right? I mean, if he ran for office, he'd be like, we know him. Like, he does good. Right? So whatever has come together around him has also created community around that. And I'm not just talking about the community to support people, it's like the world is a better place because of it. Right? So that's a strange attractor. That's how you begin to influence complex systems. Because the natural dynamics of emergence are very dangerous. Right? Genocide is emergent too. Right? Racism is emergent, poverty is emergent, but so too is prosperity, equality, a society based on love. It's emergent. It's not going to proceed from an ideology. You cannot impose your view on the rest of the world, even if you are a good person. I call it my world domination strategy. I have it all the time. When I'm working with groups of people, I can assure you that we will get the best outcomes if you all just do what I'm about to tell you to do. I'm a good person. You can trust me. Just do what I say we should do for a few minutes. Just a few minutes.
It's not unreasonable.
Yeah, we all have it. So I just call it my world domination strategy, and I notice when I'm doing it in facilitation, for example, that's what I'm doing. And sometimes, I'll tell you where, in chaotic domains, that's actually a good thing to do. All right. But in a complex domain, that's not a good thing to do, and that's why these processes that we use, our participatory processes, are about building, we'll talk about them as building containers, and allowing stuff to happen within those containers. And you hold the edge of what that is. Now, I want to let you rest with that idea for a minute. What do you mean building containers? I want you to hold that question, and we're going to deal with that in some dialogue here. What is that kind of leadership, holding containers? Where does that show up? Just hold that. I want to finish this framework. In a chaotic system, how many of you have been in a chaotic system? A riot, a flood, a fire, an accident, hurricane. Yeah, well, you have hurricanes. Snowstorms. Yeah, right. Anybody in, was it Newark, where the riots were in 1969?
Detroit.
Newark. I don't know much about Newark, but I was surprised to learn that the city hasn't recovered from that. So, what are you talking about? That's 40, how old am I? I'm the same age as the destruction of Newark.
It's your fault. You are the singular causality.
I'm big enough I can own some of that. I was about 2 weeks old when that happened. Yeah.
Newark is such a big city that planted anywhere else in the United States, it would be the major city in most states.
Right.
And nobody knows.
Nobody knows.
Anything about Newark.
Because it's stretched, you're spread out. So in a riot, the chaotic domain in the south is called Katrina. What do you call it here? What's the first? Sandy. Right? Sandy is what you call it. Remember Sandy. So cause and effect has nothing to do with each other. Forget about best practices. We are long past best practices. Like what you do in a riot is you impose very tight constraints. You grab the child out of the way of the car, right? Parents in the room?
Mm-hmm.
We've all done it. Uncles and aunts, we've all done it. And then you relax, right? You do not do the thing that some tyrannical leaders do and create the strong container to save everybody and then never let people out of it, like they did in North Korea. Massive war, massive conflict. It's like, I know, like we'll impose huge amounts of order on society and then get addicted to it. Well, that's really cool. And then you create this society that is absolutely stifling. But it's a good strategy in chaos. Impose order right away, and then it'll resolve into something like this. So a hurricane is not a very long, it's like 6 hours of real buffeting and everything like that. In that case, you get safe, you follow the police, you get out of town, you just, you do the very key things you need to do, and then once everything has kind of died down, then it's like, okay, what do we gotta do? We gotta rebuild a house. That's just complicated, no problem. I gotta get some food for the dogs, so that's an obvious solution. We gotta rebuild our communities. That's the work they didn't do in Newark, right? You can rebuild a house, you can do the obvious things, make sure everyone's taken care of, and same in New Orleans. Like, we didn't rebuild community. So what happened, the technocrats came in, they used Katrina to reinvent the education system in New Orleans, and not for the better. It's like gone all privatized, it's like a neoliberal dream now. Because all these schools were wiped out, people who had all the capacity left for Dallas and Houston and Chicago, and they never came back, and the community died. And before they could create, because this takes a while to create community, the technocrats moved in and made everything into a machine. Right? So just we gotta be careful of that. And a lot of our funding goes to support this worldview of things. Funders are not very tolerant with failure. They're not all that tolerant with experimentation. They're not all that tolerant with creating more stories like this and less stories like this. They are becoming more tolerant. There are tools that we can use in here. For example, I think this is the last thing I'll say. In this domain over here, in the ordered and predictable world, our evaluation tools are summative, right? You know what that means? It's like we let something run and we look at how well we did at the end. And we evaluate it on what's called merit and worth, right? Was it good? Did it make good use of our resources? Okay, merit, and that's the standard evaluation mechanism for bridges, but also now for human community work. And more as people demand more accountabilities, they shrink down what they measure to just a few key metrics, and then they just fund those. And if you're not hitting those targets, then they take your funding away. Or they use it as or they choose targets you can't hit, and then they just use it as an excuse to take your funding away. I mean, I don't know what's happening here, but maybe a little bit of that. We live in the same world. But there is a new set of tools coming up around complexity called Developmental Evaluation, and it's about learning and about iterating, starting small, learning, continually sensing. Somebody said it earlier in the exercise. I think it was you, Tammy. I have to keep my eye on everybody. Was that what you said? I have to watch all the time. That's what developmental evaluation is. You don't hire the evaluator to come in at the end of the project. You make sense of what's going on every staff meeting. Staff meetings become really exciting when you're doing developmental evaluation. Because every week something new is going on, and that's what your staff meetings for. Not for reporting on what you're going to do. It's like, what are you noticing? What's happening? What are the small things we need to pay attention to? Right? And the more we can monitor and pay attention to those things, the better we get. And that's a cultural thing. We did that as hunters. You know, we do that as parents. All the time with our kids, right? Every day we pick them up, we smell them, we hold them, we know what they need, what they don't need. We can discern, in your child, you can discern the language of the cry from almost the moment the child's born, because you're so close to all of those things. You know what it means, right? That's good complexity work. That is not putting the child next to a CD full of cries and comparing. That one must mean it's hungry, right? No, it's your kid and you have a relationship with it. Okay, lots to say here. And I'm not going to answer all your questions, because we could do this forever. So what I want to invite you to do is I want to invite you to get into groups of 3. Okay, and I want you to get with people you don't know. And there should be enough of you in here that you don't know. And just think about this, what this means for your work, to see the world like this. What parts of your work show up like this? What parts of your work show up like this? And what does it mean to hold a container? What does it mean to lead that way? What does that mean? So just explore those questions. There's nowhere you have to go with them. But I do want you to take this stuff And it's like, how does this show up on the ground in my work?